Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. We are very happy that Simon Sheikh is with us tonight. It's wonderful that you're here. Simon Sheikh is a curator and a theorist. He's a reader in art and program director of MFA Curating at Goldsmiths in London. He's a correspondent for the magazine Springerin and a columnist for eFlux Journal. He has been involved in several large-scale projects such as Former West or currently Bergen Assembly, which we will also be discussing tomorrow. Why it is particularly interesting to have Simon here as a guest in our program is indeed the different roles, the different perspectives he takes on and has taken on in the field of the curatorial in a broader sense. Even though it may not always be in the foreground, the relation of so-called theory and so-called practice is continuously questioned in this practice as well, which is something that we have also been experiencing here during those past days. As he has been working in these different modes of cultural production and also in very different kinds of institutions, Simon is almost by necessity also an expert when it comes to non-show. So I'm very much looking forward to his talk, The Show and the No-Show, Approaches to Presentation, Representation and Depresentation. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay. All right, can you hear me? Fine, good. Good evening. Thanks for the introduction and the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. In this particular program that I followed from both a long and short distance, because I actually live in Berlin, so it's not so far, but at the same time I've never been here before. So I'm very curious to know more about the discussions you're having. In terms of the overall program of these days, we discussed a bit back and forth how I could contribute, and this is the day of the no-show, or the non-show, which I purposefully misunderstood as no-show, because no-show means that you don't show up. So we'll talk about that a little bit today. But I will bring the no-show back to the show itself, because a show, any exhibition doesn't only show something, it also hides something. So this is something that I find particularly interesting, not just as a theorist and a political subject, but also as a practitioner. What is it that you hide? When you make something visible, what do you then make invisible? So those are some of the choices you have to make as a curator, and indeed on a larger scale as an institution, and certainly also as an educational institution. So when you decide that there are certain things that are the so-called learning outcomes, and the things you discuss, it also means that there are things you take off the table. Of course, these things are likely to change, sometimes very rapidly, other times very slowly. But nonetheless, there is never a complete picture. There's always a constellation of things. This is, in many ways, of course, what curating always does. It creates a constellation of things. So it puts together certain things and not other things. And through that, it creates propositions, we could even say worldviews. And in my work as a theorist, I see that as the intrinsic connection between art and politics, which is not the same as talking about political art making or political images, but the fact that you put together constellations of things to be looked at and things not to be looked at, that is inherently political. Okay, so I'll talk first a little bit about the no-show, and I'll come up with three kind of contemporary models of not showing. So one of them is curatorial, one of them is artistic, activistic, and the third one consumerist and possibly political, but we can talk about that. And potentially they could all be curatorial, I guess, but let's see. And then I will after that go on to the idea of the show as a place that presents, represents, and depresents. And I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to that part. So first, sort of fairly briefly, typology of no-shows. So there are three approaches, just as there will be three approaches to analyzing the show. The first one is something that came out of a work I did on trying to create, it's a kind of unfinished work in a way. Perhaps it's a failure as well, to create a typology of exhibition making, which is something that I've never really managed to do fully. But one of the terms that I thought about there was the unexhibition as a kind of curatorial format that does not curate an exhibition, but that uses the thinking, methodology, and as we even talked about this afternoon, the infrastructure and the finances of institutions of exposition to other means. The second one is a more recent phenomena that I think we have to understand, not just in a broader political sense, but really as an artistic move, a counter move towards how we can move from the historical formation of institutional critique to something we could now term infrastructural critique. And the last one, which would be the most fun, but also the briefest, is called simply the failure. What does that mean? That has, of course, to do with the no-show. So, just to go through them, a little bit what I mean by this. These are more or less, they're just case studies, so they're not exemplary. These are not about best or worst practice. They're purely illustrative, and the same with the case study I'll use to discuss how a show presents, represents, and depresents. I'll use some of my own work, so to not hang out someone else to dry, but not as an exemplary, not as prescriptive, but simply as a way in which to understand specific analytical terms. So the unexhibition is the example that I've chosen here. There's really no images except from this book, but the book I think was quite important, was something called the Caucus that I was also involved in. And the publication that later came out was called On Art, Possibility, and Democracy. I think crucial terms. So a caucus is something that we might not know in terms of artistic institutions very much. It's a strange term, similar to the term assembly that I'll briefly talk about a little bit later with the Bergen Assembly, and that we'll be discussing more tomorrow with Hans and Iris. The caucus is basically a term taken from politics. So those of you who are following the primaries of the American presidential election, you may have noticed that the first one taking place in Iowa next year is called the caucus, which is actually a different technological term than a primary. It means that only people who are registered with certain voting rights meet and caucus their candidates. So it's a specific congregation coming from politics that has to do with political subjectivity. So why would something that's a curatorial project, an art project, be called the caucus? This has to do, of course, with the three terms art, possibility, and democracy. And the argument, this is 2005, so not an argument you would make so easily today. But at that time, there was still a strong belief among my peers that artistic work was inherently democratic or inherently democratizing, so that there was a direct relationship between experimental artistic practices and democratic forms. This is a somewhat legacy of modernism, perhaps, that was found at the time. But the idea behind something like the caucus was that art offers possibilities rather than answers. So this was not an activist project. It was rather one that says, through possibility, we can reconsider democracy. So just to say a little bit more about what this project was, it was curated by three curators, one of them from Cork, which was a collective called Art Not Art, then Annie Fletcher, an Irish curator, and Charles Escher, a British/German curator. And they were asked to curate an international exhibition on the event of the city of Cork, which is in the southwestern part of Ireland. It's a very specific place, actually, was the European Capital of Culture in 2005. So for a European Capital of Culture, you need different things, and of course you need a big international art exhibition. So you invite some curators to this, but here the response, which was an interesting one, was to reject the idea, but rather say, let's have an open-ended institutional form of a caucus, which will consist of reading groups, various meetings, workshops with citizens, artists doing site-specific and social projects, discursive programs, but no exhibition. So the project took place in a former primary school. Again, interesting choice of venue. So a former school that was transformed into the center of activities, and there were lots of reading groups, workshops, meetings, etc. But what's of course interesting about this as a no-show is that it's purely curatorial. So if you mark the proper names that I mentioned, Charles Esche, Annie Fletcher, More Than Art, Not Art, who probably nobody here knows about, they are of course internationally renowned curators that comes with a curatorial proposition for the Cultural Capital of Cork, saying we should not have a mega exhibition. What we should curate is a series of events, discussions, talks, etc. So it's mainly an unfolding discursive program. So that becomes an international curatorial format through projects like this one. So this is a typology that we know. So instead of making a show, you do something like this. So we meet and have conversations, but they're based in art theory, and that kind of world that we inhabit. So it's a purely curatorial format, but not one that shows many, if any, actual artworks. Right? So it does not consist of things or objects, but of conversations and discourses, and usually quite a lot of theory, particularly political theory. So that's the one form of not showing, which is the most curatorial. The second one is actually comes out of artistic practices. I could have taken other examples, but I find them, you see it's also almost 10 years after the something like the Cork Caucus. Now, the Cork Caucus is just one example because it's so clearly defined as being structured through curating. So it wasn't structured through community groups themselves, political theories, political parties, or anything like that. It was really thought of the same way as you think of curating an exhibition. So by saying that there is a possibility in art and how art institutes for democratic dialogue, it is perhaps no wonder that more and more people involved in the art world are starting to question the structures, the infrastructures in which we work as democratic. So the works are democratic, but what we find is that the institutions themselves are autocratic. Right? We have very little influence, we have very little say on how art institutions govern. And this has really come to the fore through the use of boycotts. And we've seen more and more of them. And I would insist that we see them not only as reactions to bad governance, but as proactive attempts at taking the promise of art institutions speaking for democracy literally and seriously. So in 2014, there's been many other cases of boycotts. There was the manifesto in St. Petersburg, there's and others. But this one, as you can see here, some of the from the images. This is up here in the corner, the official poster. You imagine what you desire. That's a typical biennial title, I think, which is speaks about artistic production, and again the possibilities inherent in that. What it does not speak about, that title, I hope, is the funding structures and the political governance behind the biennial. So what you see below, Boycott Transfield, is from some of the protests and activism happening in Sydney at the time. Transfield is a company that basically, among other things, It's a security company, among other things, and they are responsible for the internment camps in the Strait Islands and in northern Australia, where they intern all the refugees. So this is one of the things that this company does. We could have taken other examples. We could take the sponsorship of BP Oil, of Tate Modern. We could have taken Israeli state support for the Sao Paulo Biennial. But what we see is that some of these companies that sponsor and fund art institutions are being questioned. So this is not exactly new, but it's fairly new that we have such strong reactions. So what you finally see here on your right side, my left side, is the campaign that was started by artists that was showing in the biennial. They heard about Transfield. Some of them had connections to local activists, and basically put pressure on the biennial to divest, to discontinue the collaboration with this main sponsor, one of the main sponsors. And they used the main capital that you have as an artist when you're showing, which is to be a no-show. So basically, they said that they would withdraw their participation and their works from the biennial if the biennial did not divest from Transfield. So what happened was that the biennial did actually divest from Transfield. So I would say the director was quite attentive to the issues. Anyway, my point is not whether this was a successful campaign or not. And you could say that it was, in one way. But rather that you see that a discussion that has nothing to do with what's shown by curating comes to the fore. It's rather that which is not shown, which is the funding stream. And that, I would say, moves a little bit from, we'll not spend too much time on this, but it moves a little bit, it expands from the notion of institutional critique into a notion of infrastructural critique. So of course what we see now, which is very, very interesting, is a kind of talking back to the power structures of the art world, from artists and from activists, taking institutions and curators to task for their affiliations of an economic and therefore political kind. Now, we might all have different notions of where and when to stop, where and when to say, not this money, only that money. That's another long discussion. But what's interesting is that this discussion is now part of curatorial discourse and how institutions have to work. And I would say that's on a global scale. So that's what I think is a quite new turn of events. And we even see here the slogan, which I think is quite good, don't add value to mandatory detention. So they pointed directly to the kind of symbolic capital that artists grant the institution or the companies that sponsor them. So why would companies sponsor art institutions? It's not because of the huge audience numbers, even though they tend to be huge for these biennials. They could advertise elsewhere and have much greater visibility for their products than sponsoring art institutions. It's because of the transfer of symbolic capital from artists themselves. So, so this is another way of showing what's not shown and doing it through saying we will not show up. So a rejection of the power structures and a kind of active withdrawal that I think is now part of the conversation everywhere. And it's very interesting because, of course, it has led to a huge sense of confusion because all major museums are now looking at who are funding them and trying to figure out what can we get away with, who should we continue working with, and who should we not. And this is totally context-specific, so it would vary from country to country, from city to city. Okay, so another kind of more passive, aggressive form of rejection is the failure. So what if we put on a show and nobody shows up? Yeah, so this is also a way of being a non-show, a no-show. You put on a show, but nobody shows up. Is it then still an exhibition? Or is it a failed exhibition? The image here is not to say that this particular curatorial team is a failure, far from it. I just really like the concept. This is a duo based in Paris. There's a kind of anti-Rangerian slant to their work. But basically taking a somewhat ironic comment. They're called Le Peuple qui manque, which means, as it's translated, a people, or the people actually, is missing. So it's to say this category of the people that you're trying to produce through art making, through the kind of politicizing of art, is actually not there. They don't show up, they're not interested. So it questions whether how you produce a people through cultural production. And it questions the uptake. But of course, this is a more silent version, and often probably with a different politics than the boycott. But we could, of course, see the lack of participation as a kind of boycott, just not under that name. And that has many interesting aspects, I think. Also, in terms of museums as arbiters of taste. So we've all, in most nation states, grown up with the national galleries, national history museums, telling us what to believe, sometimes critically, sometimes not, but they're telling us what to believe and trying to educate us into becoming national citizens. But probably more and more of us are realizing that that mode of address is somewhat faulty. Many people go into museums and do not recognize themselves, do not recognize the story they're being told, do not feel they're represented by the architecture, by the mode of address, by the storytelling that's going on in the museum. So often the people are missing. So I thought I couldn't help myself but to bring in this image, and I'm wearing the same jacket today as I am out in this image. So this is from the Bergen Assembly. This is a project that you'll hear more about tomorrow, so I won't talk too much about it. Just show you that as a fairly new triennial form, this was the third edition that we worked with under the directorship of Hans and Iris, the idea was also to say the form of the triennial does not have to be a show. It can be a show, but it could also be other things. So in our case, and also in the previous editions, there was lots of activities going on that had a different social and political aspects, and that were process-orientated and was not visible in the show. And as you can see, this was not a case of the people not showing up. Actually, as a matter of fact, there was a huge uptake of these events. Unfortunately, the critical reception in the local press didn't discuss that, but rather said that, oh, this is not really art, it's not beautiful enough, it's not local enough, nobody can understand this, but actually, tons of people are interested in something they don't understand. So the one thing I would say you can't use as a curator ever is the critical reception of art criticism. It's like the least useful response. Listen to the people who show up instead. The assembly form is, again, an interesting metaphor. It's not dissimilar from the idea of the caucus, but an assembly, of course, one of the strange things about the Bergen Assembly is that I would argue it has philosophically, it's an impossibility, but interestingly enough, with curating and with art making, you can sometimes do things that are philosophically impossible. You can actually perform them, even though they're philosophically not possible. The assembly form, as I would see it, is a spontaneous form where groups of people, communities or otherwise, self-organize in a certain temporal frame towards specific goals and specific terms of critique. That is, to right something that's unjust. right? So this is, of course, what Occupy did. This is Gezi Park, etc. The assembly assembles to address power and address a wrong. This seems to me to be quite far from what biennials and triennials are doing. But again, this is also structurally, most institutions of that kind, like triennials and biennials, are instituted from the top down. So they are not coming from the ground up from people themselves. So they can't technically be assemblies. This is impossible, right? But at the same time, of course, by saying this is an assembly, you open a metaphorical space for interaction that allows us to think about the encounter with art and the ideas in art in a different way than saying this is a triennial. So there's a kind of conjuring trick involved that should allow for a different kind of encounter and a different sense of possibly dialogue, critique involved in that encounter. So it's a logical impossibility that an institution of that kind could be an assembly, but it creates, it conditions you in an interesting way to think about what that institution can do, including its funding streams, in a different way. Okay, so I think these were the kind of models of the no-show that I wanted to really discuss. I'm sure we can think of more, but one is, as I said, the on-exhibition and curatorial format. It's a strictly curated idea of what a non-exhibition, or I've called it on-exhibition, because it still demonstrates. So it still does some of the curatorial lessons in power and knowledge that exhibitions do. It demonstrates, but it demonstrates through other means than the showing of objects. The boycott is a demonstration of a different kind, but often one that counters curatorial decisions that trade as if though they are not curatorial decisions, such as where you take money from and how you structure the governmental aspects of an art institution or a large-scale exhibition, such as biennials or documenta, as some people talked about earlier today. And the last one, which I think is quite interesting, and I still think for me, or for sure for me, it's not really clear how this works as a category, but it's about rejection. What happens when you fail? Because the failing to put on a show or a successful show might mean that you'll be non-showing for the rest of your so-called career as a curator. So it will have professional ramifications when you fail, because then nobody will hire you to put on another show. So you will be dealing with non-shows after that. So we should never forget failure. It's important. At the same time, so I want to bring this back to the idea of the show itself, which is, what does a show show, and how does it do it? And I've suggested these three different terms. Presentation, representation, and depresentation. The first two are likely to be familiar, the third one less so. It's also more of a neologism. But I think that when we analyze exhibition making, and even institutions, we have to do it through all three levels. And it's not so that you advance from one to the other, but rather that they happen simultaneously. So I will use a case study, which is an exhibition that I curated in 2011 called Vectors of the Possible, which dealt with, we don't really need to go too much into the theme, but in a way it was also an exhibition centered around this relationship that I find intrinsically between art and politics, which is in what is visible and what is not visible. And in this case it was through the notion of the horizon of the possible in relation to space of experience. So the works were curated around that basic idea. But anyway, it's mostly just to talk about these three levels. So here you have, I'll just talk about three works in a little bit, but here you have the group Free. In front of it there's a monitor with a Hito-style film, and then this is a reverse shot of the same room, where you have Sharon Hayes and Matthew Buckingham. But I'll just talk briefly about Free's work, Matthew Buckingham's work, and Sharon Hayes' work. But we'll start just with this image. So this is what you would have seen when you entered the space. So this was quite sort of significant work because it's a billboard, so it covers the whole back wall, and it would catch your attention just on the level of presentation. So what exactly is presentation, and where does it differ from representation? So for this, we can turn to the kind of image historian / art historian Georges Didi Uberman, who has written quite interestingly about this in a book called Confronting Images from 1990, in which he writes, basically that book is a kind of critique of art history's obsession with iconography and the notion of representation. And he finds someone like Norman Bryson was onto some of the same things, but from a kind of point of view of semiotics. Then within images themselves, there is more than representation. There are conflicts of desire and affect that falls outside of representation, that are even at the level of the image itself. So presentation often has to do with the image, with the level of the image itself. You could say without interpretation. But of course, as we know, it's impossible to look at something without starting to interpret it. So presentation immediately slips into representation. So Uberman writes about this quite eloquently, I think. So I'm just going to quote him here when he says, this is at the very beginning of his book, Confronting Images. Often, when we pose our gaze to an art image, we have a forthright sensation of paradox. So this is the paradox between presentation and representation, obviously. What reaches us immediately and straight away is marked with trouble, like a self-evidence that is somehow obscure. Whereas what initially seemed clear and distinct is, we soon realize, the result of a long detour, a mediation, a use of words. But in the end, this paradox is perfectly banal. Again, he's talking about the difference between presentation and representation. And I think that kind of has to do with this image too, because it presents itself quite differently from what it represents, I think. But I'll get to that. Force a reading of the image on you in a minute. So he goes on to say, we can embrace it. So this is the paradox. We can embrace it, let ourselves be carried away by it. We can even experience a kind of jouissance, pleasure, if you will, upon feeling ourselves alternately enslaved and liberated by this braid of knowledge and non-knowledge, of universality and singularity, of things that elicit naming and things that leave us gaping. All this on one and the same surface of a picture, where nothing has been hidden, where everything before us has been simply presented. Right? So this is the first level. It's just there. The image simply just presents itself. It's us who starts interpreting and saying, oh, it represents this or that. You know, this abstract painting represents mental illness, for example. Right? But he goes on to say, we can, conversely, feel dissatisfied with such a paradox, want not to let things lie, want to know more, want to represent to ourselves in a more intelligible way what an image before us still seemed to hide within it. And so, of course, this image kind of hides a lot of things. Because it uses text, it is very difficult to see it as purely presentation. So it already represents something because it is in the form of a statement. You might even consider this image just in terms of the statement and not the image itself. So, yeah, I don't know how easy it is to make out what's actually on the image, but basically what you see is a staged performance. So this trio of artists from the UK called Free, they just disbanded a few months ago, by the way, a staged performances and photograph them. So the performances were usually without audience, and the performance was not the work was the photograph. The photographs were then distributed as billboards, postcards, and in exhibitions. So in a kind of circulation of images, if you will. And they usually involved a slogan, or what people in the advertising business called slogos. They are slogans that are so easy to remember that they almost become like a logo. So when you think of the swastika, you also think of just do it. Yeah, that works as the logo, hence the term's logo. So this is photographed in a rundown quarry. So that basically means that there is no horizon in the image. It's very difficult to kind of grasp what the context is, because it's a disused quarry. Then it has the three artists themselves, which you maybe cannot make out on this slide, but they're holding the banner. So one on each side and one in the middle, almost completely hidden. I think you can see a little bit of the head and the legs. So they are performing this quite absurd task. The banner is obviously way too huge to be used in a protest. And they physically struggling with stretching it, so clearly it's made for the image production. And then, of course, the text itself kind of overwhelms them, and both in a aesthetical form of the banner, but also, I would say, in the claim, in the statement of the text. Yeah, of course, it's not a neutral statement. You have to, I think you have to agree or disagree with that statement. Or maybe it's just a paradox, I don't know. So this is, you can see how it's almost impossible here to not move from the moment of presentation to the moment of representation. Representation then has a quite, of course, long critical history in opposition to depresentation, which is something that we are kind of only beginning to discuss, I think, in the intellectual community. Just two notions of representation that I think are crucial for curatorial work, both fairly canonical examples. One, of course, is the cultural studies classic called Representation, written by Stuart Hall, originally in the first edition in the late 1970s and then revised in 1997. It's written for the Open University, so it's really written as a kind of study book. And in this book, Hall uses the term, the cultural turn, that he defines in the following way, which I think is very interesting in thinking of curating not just as exhibition making. But he says, culture, it is argued, is not so much a set of things, novels and paintings, or TV programs and comics, as it is a process, a set of practices. So I would say the same, of course, with exhibition making, and also curating that does not put on exhibitions. It is not so much a set of things or objects, it is primarily processes, a practice. So if it is a practice, we can understand it and criticize it in that way. This is, of course, 97, so we see that Stuart Hall deliberately puts up the dichotomy between novels and paintings on the one hand and TV programs and comics on the other, so you can see the high and low culture debate in that, which may not concern us too much now. TV programs, maybe you would say YouTube channels now, comics, Instagram instead. Anyway, you can exchange these terms. What is interesting still is to say it's moving from notion of presentation to representation. It's not the thing in itself. It is rather the set of processes that makes it into something we call a practice. Hall goes on to say, quote further, primarily culture is concerned with the production and the exchange of meanings, the giving and taking of meaning between the members of a society or a group. So this is a very interesting term, giving and taking of meanings. So it's not just debating meaning, it's actually giving something meaning, but also taking away meaning from other things. This will lead us into the last term, depresentation, that I'll talk about in a minute. So in representation, depresentation is also inherent, the same way presentation is. He says, so it's members of a society or a group. This, I think, is easy to understand. Then he goes on to say, interestingly, and as I was rereading it for this presentation, I of course, the main criticism that that is now from certain people in art theory and art practice against these ideas of representation comes, of course, from certain versions of affect theory. Not so much the kind of queer feminist affect theory of Sarah Ahmed, but more the kind of performative Deleuzian version of someone like Simon O'Sullivan. And others who say, representation has nothing to do with art. Art is all about affect. Which I don't necessarily want to disagree with or take issue with, but it's just fascinating that the criticism is usually targeted towards Stuart Hall's theories that are considered to be too obtuse, too didactic. But he actually writes that culture is about feelings, attachments, and emotions as well as concepts and ideas. So for Hall, the theory of representation actually encompasses affect. The emphasis, he says, on cultural practices is important. It is participants in a culture who give meaning to people, objects, and events. Things in themselves rarely, if ever, have any one single, fixed, or unchanging meaning. It is by our use of things and what we say, think, and feel about them, how we represent them, that we give them a meaning, and this he underlines. So the way we use things and how we feel about them is how we represent them. I mean, to me, this sounds like a very apt description of curatorial processes. So that's Stuart Hall. He then goes on to say there are two levels of systems of representation, etc., that you need a shared conceptual map, but you also need a shared language. Maybe, considering the time, we will skip that. You can go and read it. Probably lots of people have read it already. So in this cultural theory of representation is inherent a relationship to representation in a political sense. So in the Representations book from Hall, he also, of course, quotes Chantal Mouffe and Nestor Laclau, who has, of course, written about representation in a political sense. Here, I'll just quote from, this is a very complicated passage from Laclau. I stopped reading it with my students because they find it too complicated. And it is, very complicated. It's this strange influence of Lacan and Heidegger into a Gramscian thinker. In a book called Emancipations, also from, I think, 96, there is a very interesting essay in that book called Power and Representation, which of course is about political representation. But when we're talking of art and democracy, art and politics, it's interesting to look at that model of representation in politics and see how that leads into the discussions we often have about the politics of representation, the burden of representation, and the politics of the subject, speaking subject in art. So what Laclau is interested in is the idea of representation in a political sense being one body or more speaking on behalf of absent bodies. But he wants to take issue with the idea that there is a kind of perfect or full representation possible, or that there is an authentic way of representing someone else. So often the example would be political parties, or let's say other kinds of negotiations. Let's say here at this school, the student union would have issues and problems. There's a climate strike right now, but there might be other strikes, etc. So the management and the professors would have to then meet with the students, particularly if there's boycotts, sit-down strikes, blockades, etc., and discuss this. So the assembly form would say, we all have to be there. Representation of politics will say, okay, these are our student representatives. They will talk to the management and explain what we want and why we are unhappy, etc. So they will then negotiate and they will come back, and then some of the other students will say, oh, you did a horrible job, you only got like 3 out of 10 demands, or others will say, okay, that's fine. So he wants to reject the idea that there is such a thing as perfect representation and that it has to do with skills, but rather that there is, in the moment of representation itself, a basic asymmetry. And I think that's interesting when we think of how artworks or artists are to represent someone or something. It came up in the discussion with Ron Grupper. They're saying we do not want to represent our identity, even though we are identified. Yeah, so this is always the problem. So Lachlau says, what is involved in a process of representation? Essentially, the fictio juris, so the fictional juridical body, that somebody is present in a place from which he or she is materially absent. The representation is the process by which someone else, the representative, substitutes for and at the same time embodies the represented. So the representative substitutes all the others and at the same time embodies them because they are there physically. The conditions for a perfect representation would be met, it seems, when this representation is a direct process of transmission of the will of the represented, when the act of representation is totally transparent in relation to that will. Right? This, he then goes on to say, is basically impossible, because he says, from neither the side of the representative nor that of the represented do the conditions of a perfect representation obtain, and this is a result not of what is empirically attainable, but the very logic inherent in the process of representation. By this he goes on to say, and this is what he means, so as far as the represented is concerned, if he or she needs to be represented at all, if you need someone to represent you, it's obviously because you can't speak for yourself. This is what happens in a legal situation. You need a legal. This is the result, he says, of the fact that his or her basic identity is constituted in a place A, and decisions that will affect you takes place in place B. Right? So in this case, your identity is an incomplete identity, and the relation of representation, far from referring to some true self, some fully fleshed identity, is, he says, a supplement necessary to the constitution of this identity. That's somewhat theoretically complicated, but what he means is that by the very nature of needing representation, representation is not something that subtracts truth or value. It's rather something that gives value, that creates identity through representation. So it's a supplement, not a subtraction. This is very interesting if we think of how artworks are supposed to represent certain things, certain ideas, certain feelings, certain people, that they are supplementing. That's what they do. They do not subtract. So that, of course, finally leaves me with this notion of depresentation. So as we also saw with Stuart Hall, it's the giving and taking meaning that is the moment of representation. But as soon as you supplement and create an identity, you prevent others from emerging. So it's as much an ethical dilemma as a political one, I think, to curate. Because you have to make decisions on visibility and invisibility. And often those are made involuntarily, that you're so dedicated to making certain things visible that you inadvertently make other things invisible. In other cases, you very consciously decide what to make invisible. I think it came up earlier today for those who were here this afternoon. Who do you want to assemble with and who do you not want to assemble with? So it's maybe a little bit difficult to see, but this is another work that I think is very interesting in terms of political representation that was in this particular exhibition. which is a piece by the American artist Matthew Buckingham. It's called The Six Grandfathers, Pahasapa, in the year 500,002 CE, so quite a long time from now. And it's sort of, again, so this work, I would say, goes back to prehistory and speculates on a future history. But of course, at the time it was made, I don't think any of the calculations that decided on this image, I don't know if you can see it very well, didn't think about climate change. So probably this will happen a lot sooner than this image. So I think in the year 500,002 CE, you won't even have the rest of the mountain as you have here. But this is Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. And what the artist did was I don't know how familiar you are with Mount Rushmore, but basically this is a very spectacular mountain, and on the side of it there are carved 4 of the founding fathers of the United States. So George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Abraham Lincoln was also there, and I can't remember who the 4th one was. But there are 4 carved faces on this mountain. But of course, after 500,000 years, these faces will disappear, right? So they may be carved as a monument to American liberty and therefore posterity, but they will of course disappear with time. Now, Mount Rushmore was called by its founders a shrine to democracy, but of course it is carved out on land that was stolen from the Native American Sioux Nation, and it was made by an artist who was an active member of the Ku Klux Klan. And to this day, Mount Rushmore is a contested site by the Native Americans. They have never... So there is this strange logic, of course, about treaties and non-treaties, similar to show, non-show, I suppose. But there is no treaty. We can discuss if there's any kind of justice in the so-called treaties that happened after the systemic genocide of the indigenous population in the Americas. But there is no treaty around Mount Rushmore. So this was actually part of the so-called reservation. But because of its spectacular nature, the governor of South Dakota decided they should have a monument. And to this day, it's contested. So there was produced this image, which is, of course, again, not only represents history, but it depresents very directly. It defaces the 4 American icons. And it rewrites, in a way, history. So it's next to the image, you have the most recent events, and then it goes back to so-called prehistory. This one is about some of the struggles around reclaiming the land that happened in the 1970s. I think by now the state of South Dakota have officially annexed the land and said there will be no possibility of ever returning it to the Sioux Nation. Interestingly, it was actually even was also a very specific site in the Native American culture that has been forgotten. So. You have a different political history of the United States that basically rewrites the history through the struggle of the Native Americans and the systemic genocide of them, together with the destruction of the image. So it creates a different notion of history and a different perspective on the future. So what it does is that it represents and depresents at the same time. So maybe... I won't spend time on this last work, although it's a very nice one. But just to recapitulate a little bit some of the ideas around depresentation is that, of course, whenever you create a specific narrative, whenever you create a specific constellation, so in Walter Benjamin, a constellation is something that you decide according to an image of certain stars, a certain perspective, but it's one that is not a full picture, and of course it's one that reaches us from something that's already long gone. So the stars are messages from planets long, or suns long distinct. But the constellation is of course always a selective process that only involves certain signs, certain stories, certain objects, certain possibilities. And sometimes by default, it erases others. At the same time, the way that depresentation is involved in any representation, it is also, and can be, acts of violence. Right? So you can deliberately remove stories, works, events from history, from nations, and some of the best examples, I would say, are what's happening in a place like Hungary with the Museum of Terror, if anybody has visited this particularly wonderful institution, which rewrites the history of first the Nazi occupation and later communist times as one history of occupation of the free people of Hungary. So it's of course entirely possible to have depresentation not be a default inherent practice in acts of representation, but also a violent political logic to deliberately remove possibilities, remove ideas from the field of the possible. So hopefully you have some questions to this somewhat loose sketch of what presentation, representation, and depresentation means outside of doing a show and within doing a show. Thanks.
Maybe we can use this one to pass around. Yeah, so there is a microphone over there, and are there any... Are there any questions, comments? Yes, back.
Yeah, in the beginning you said that some companies, they still invest money in art venues, even though it would be more, or they would have more exposure if they would do it in conventional ways. And I was wondering how, or is there a connection also to the, yeah, I basically didn't understand that quite, why they still do that. Why is it?
Well, I mean, my take on it would be that it's the symbolic capital of art is one that is very hard to price. Indeed, that's the game that the art market has to play, but in a way, all of us, which is how do you translate symbolic capital into real capital? As soon as you make a showing of any kind of actual equation, you would have ruined the magic trick that is the pricing. So this is, I think, related. Maybe that's a better way of illustrating how that symbolic capital lends itself. So basically, by taking the money from this company, the artist activist made the argument that it's a kind of whitewashing of that company, and that's what the company wants, is that symbolic transfer. But I think there's more in terms of value production or value creation. I think that the reason why companies and also high net worth individuals, as they so beautifully call it, collect art is because it's principally the only thing you cannot just buy for money. So all of us can go into a luxury store here or in London or anywhere and buy whatever we want if we have the money. You cannot, principally, it's getting this argument is getting weakened, I would say. But principally, you can't go into a gallery and buy whatever you want. You have to be accepted as a potential collector. So I think that's the allure and the value. That's what makes it interesting. So once you get that, you're kind of consecrated. And of course, you can show it to your friends. So this is the sort of the logic that collectors and galleries buy into. Why I say it's weakened is that now so many galleries are having economic problems that they probably will just sell to pretty much everyone. But that's a recent development. But historically, I think that that particular interest comes from the fact that it's not just about money, it's also about culture. And that you are cultured and cultivated. And so buying into these objects make you cultivated. And of course, if you're cultivated, then people will think less of the violence. At the same time, this kind of violence is now getting very popular. So this is another where this is the on a kind of infrastructural level, what will happen to the funding streams of art, the way that they have tended to come more and more from specific foundations and very rich people, that with the kind of movement towards deglobalization and so-called right-wing populism, even though I think it's not the most apt term, but you have a kind of less of a need to identify yourself with culture, right? So if you see a lot of the figures that's from the far right, they would not just reject so-called political art, they would reject all kind of contemporary art. So that need for representation in a certain part of the capitalist class seems to be on the wane. That might create some other problems for us, but that's a whole other talk.
And I was also, may I have a follow-up? Yeah. And I was curious regarding the funding streams. Would you say that there is was there a shift back in 2008 with the financial crisis that some funding streams were cut off and new emerged? I mean, no.
There's a major difference. It was, again, it's a complicated landscape, at least across Europe anyway. So there was already, through, depending on which country you look at, how far advanced new liberal reform of the public system was and is, there was already systemic defunding of public funding to the arts. And that's supposed to be supplanted by private sponsorships and private-public partnerships. So that was, I think that logic was already in place, but of course, so-called austerity has made that, has accelerated that process, for sure. So I don't know, I mean, with the Bergen Assembly, for example, I don't know if Hans and Rees will talk about that tomorrow, but this is one of the last places where I think in Europe where it would be possible for an institution to work that way, because Norway still has huge public funding. It's maybe Norway and Switzerland, maybe, the only countries left in Europe that has a large public funding, and also one that doesn't require match funding from private enterprise in order to get the public funding that's left. So in more and more places it would be structurally impossible. You have to, most of the biennials, the way they are produced now and have to be produced is through the galleries. So remember that, think of the infrastructure. When people are critical of saying, why is it always the same artists with gallery representation? You cannot make a show of that size without the galleries paying for it, because there is not the core funding and the public funding for it. So a few foundations, some private investors, and then the galleries basically pay for the works, and they pay for them, of course, thinking that they can then sell them with a higher price because they're in a biennial. So
maybe also to add why, in this case, they sponsor that. I don't think it's only about the symbolic, because this wouldn't be enough, because it's, I think it's in the moment, it's everything, capitalism is in a kind of a transformation, of course, by the conditions of Google etc., etc. We know what that means. In this case, it's very clear. This job was a state job. And the state hired a private company to do the job. So these guys sitting together at the same table to make the next deal. So this is this merging between what already Hannah Arendt described for the early 20th century. This is already the merging between the private field and the state-run businesses or jobs. The detention, this is very clear, this camps. So this has to be seen from this double layers of national representation, of what is a biennial, and how this private money is coming then into it by the conditions that they are connected with the construction of the nation state. So this is a kind of a nice meeting of nice people, and one hand gives the other. So this is that one example in South Korea. It's impossible even to announce Samsung because they are in all the biennials and they are one of the worst employees you can work for. And it has this paradox that one of these biennials in Gwangju is maybe one of the still most political biennials because they wanted to overcome the narrative of the massacre of 1980. So, but everybody who's doing there an exhibition is referring to it. And it has this paradox that this biennial is impossible to do without the money of Samsung. And when you're looking then in this cluster between Samsung and the states, then you again in this same construction. The other is this transformation of the capitalistic streams, which are collecting our behaviors. And of course, by this, capitalist money is very much spread in all fields, and especially culture, because it's a very good dot on the landscape where you collect behaviors to give you a consumer identity.
Maybe, yes, no. Thank you very much for your talk and for the kind of extremely dense collection of examples and possible perspectives. I'm intrigued by this image in terms of representation and depresentation. Yeah. Because I'm wondering if we talk about representation as something that takes place, that takes so much space that something else cannot become visible. What do we do with something like that? I can't talk anymore. That represents something, and by that does not allow for the presentation of something else. And it represents transfield much more. It makes it become more prominent than it actually should be if we follow the content of what is said. And I think this might perhaps be, for me at least, represents the double bind that you're always in when you represent. Yeah, maybe you could sense.
Well, I mean, this is actually interesting because the image is from the Biennial Foundation website. This is how they describe it. By the way, I should have had photo credits. I'm not the most PowerPoint sassy person, but no. What I want to say is, of course, this is of course the problem with representation in the sense of. I think Agamben writes about this as well. When you point to something, you make it an example, right? So this gesture of pointing, and that's of course what a boycott and a protest does. So they're also quite blunt instruments. Yeah. So you either boycott or you don't. There is no real kind of. You can have discussions before or maybe after, but the boycott is boycott. You're on one side or the other. There's no room for maneuver otherwise. But that's I guess is the yeah. I don't think anybody probably talks about imagining about that show. Everybody talks about this instead. But I think in this case, the artist also knew that they would give visibility. So it was a kind of transfer of representation to the protesters protesting Transfield and Transfield's internment camps. And I guess by extension, what Hans mentioned, the private-public collaboration, basically having a private security company doing a public job. So it was a way of saying, actually, this boycott, now I'm interpreting Ahmed Ogut very heavily, I suppose, but he should have, was to say, instead of doing some work in the exhibition a video that might relate to this, by saying we will withdraw, we will stand with the protesters, you give the space of representation to the protesters, and you make everything about Transfield. So of course you know that what you criticize, you put onto the center stage. But I would say in this example, it was not that that this was part of the purpose, right, to do that. So it's different than in other cases. So I mean, I've written about that elsewhere, but I try to compare some of those boycotts, which is interesting because they're quite different. So some of the debates around the following year, or was it the same year in Sao Paulo, which was about taking Israeli state money that a lot of the artists did not want to be in the biennial if it had state support from Israel, because they supported the BDS boycott. And the biennial organization not supporting BDS, again for political reasons. And the curator, of course, then being caught in the middle between those two, which is so that's a completely different case. So they have to be seen in that way. My point of bringing them up is to think of them really as part of a contemporary history of art, as much as the sociology of art, and see it as part of contemporary curating, is that this is now an instrument and a gesture that is used and is part of the discourse that we all have to consider when we're talking about curating. I mean, in practical terms, of course, you have to, but I think also in analytical terms and in theoretical terms, we have to think about it.
Okay, a different question. I guess I haven't quite, or I'm asking myself now, if there is truly such a thing like presentation, because I'm thinking you said presentation is an image without interpretation, but I'm thinking, well, images are always interpreted, I'm thinking. I mean, maybe I didn't understand if that's only about...
well, I mean, yeah, I think it's very difficult to... so some people would insist on that, right? I think in a way that's also in Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation. Those kind of ideas was to try and say, let's not start to represent to ourselves. And in Ubermann's book, he basically says that the whole discourse of visuality in art history is always about representation, but there is something else that just presents itself, that actually sometimes through the image itself, the object itself, deconstructs and at least somehow destabilizes the act of representation, which is of course interesting when you're thinking of religious art and Christian art, which is all about representation principally. So, so there is that aspect, but I would certainly also say that there is that aspect in terms of, if we understand representation the way that Stuart Hall does it, is that you have to have a system of representation show a culture and a language through which you represent. So of course we often, I think the best example is really there was this tattoo artist in Los Angeles that gave these tattoos of Chinese signs to celebrities, and they didn't know what they meant, and they just liked them because they were cool looking. And then some of them found out that they meant something really horrible and have sued this guy. So there you see there was really just a level of presentation. The presentation of that image, of course, then makes the bearer of the tattoo represent themselves as cool. But there is that strange shift. So if they actually knew what those signs were, they wouldn't have chosen them. So there, I think you can kind of see. So it's I would say it's impossible to stay on the level, if we will, of presentation. But it's also impossible to just stay on the level of representation. Yeah. So you will always slip between, and I think you have to be very conscious of that. And sometimes, of course, audiences experience this differently than you thought as an artist or as a curator. But there's always presentation, representation, and depresentation involved in the layout.
I just wanted to add, because it's funny, but it's also a brain freeze to listen to the 3 words being so similar. So I'm trying to find like synonyms. Sounds like synonym. For representation, and I'm just thinking reference. Mm-hmm. Isn't it very close to reference? I mean.
Yeah, I mean you could substitute, but you could think of presentation in terms of presence, representation in terms of a reference, as you say, narrative or the level of the sign, and depresentation in terms of absence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. Okay.
Maybe can I ask a question? In the case of such a boycott, is it possible, I don't know if you can answer that in this general way, but to incorporate the critique of the boycott by the biennial and benefit in the end of it?
Well, from whose perspective?
The biennial.
Well, yes, actually, because that's what happened with the Whitney Biennial, for sure. So the discussion there is with the inclusion of Dana Schutz's work in this highly provocative way next to African American artists dealing with police violence. The discussion is, they refused to remove the work, right? And they said, we stand by our artists, which probably most curators should do. So it's an easy principled answer, but I don't think it was the correct one, by the way. But that's a long story. We can discuss also. But a very interesting case in this here because this is on the level of hearsay and room. There are those who say that they knew very well that it would bring this reaction, and the discussion in the museum was that no, it's good because this will bring more visitors, the controversy will bring more visitors, which it did. This, of course, we don't know, we can only speculate, but you could say, if that's the case, then that would be a case of using the controversy to your advantage as an institution.
Hello, thank you for being here. I have just a brief understanding question because you brought up the 2 terms of institution critique and infrastructural critique, and just an understanding question, where would you like define it, and where's the difference between it? Is it just like scaling up the complexity of the field addressed by that critique, or where is that shift? Yeah. Is that a declaration from your side, or
so this is there are different, this is not something I'm particularly working on, but there are different people working on it now, also writing PhDs and so on. So it's a discussion that's entered the art field, I would say, a little bit from architecture. But also Marina Wischmidt has written about it, but hasn't really continued that. But she has one text about it, which is where she tries to introduce infrastructural critique as a expansion slash supplement to institutional critique. But institutional critique had, of course, many forms, but an artistic strategy, but was a lot of the time about representation. It was also about funding. It was not necessarily about the mode of governance, the structural architecture, and particularly in terms of the digital and what we talked about with Google, more contemporary ways that we are mapped and indexed that are infrastructural. So in architectural theory, some of the people writing that would be Adam Greenfield, Keller Easterling, Eyal Weissman, which kind of says that the infrastructural choices that are made before we enter spaces are already defining everything that will happen, more or less, and are where we should think politically and critically and intervene, which is something we often don't think about. The infrastructure, we think just of the spatial structures, the urban fabric and so on, but not the infrastructural decisions that has predetermined a lot of our spaces of experience. So this is why some people are now trying to figure out what would that mean to think of an infrastructural critique within the art world, which is not just about the financial structures, but also about digital modes of governance in terms of how institutions are made and how they think publicly.
Maybe to extend this question or to make it even more complicated or something like that, it's also quite interesting that there are other fields coming together. When you're reading a book like Optical Media from Kittler again, which was written in '99, and he's describing an entire media landscape of infrastructure. And then a young US-American art historian is searching what Laszlo Molinoch done in the First World War. What was his job? And he was in ballistic of a Horwitz. And when you're looking in the graphical structure of this manual, of this book, then you recognize the aesthetical structure of his drawings he done later at the Bauhaus. So it's quite interesting. Yeah? And this is not an ethical or moralistic approach. This is the question how far infrastructure is embedded in also our aesthetical practices. And this is a kind of a field which is research in art history and on the side of the institutions.
Hi. So you've mentioned that curating has an ethical dilemma and a political one sort of involved with it within the practice. And I was wondering, how do you navigate the realm of curatorial ethics within your own practice? And if it's a question of personal responsibility or maybe like shared responsibility, or yeah, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, it's difficult to generalize, but I would say maybe just to illustrate with okay. We in the Bergen Assembly we had one of the artists that I commissioned. We had a major conflict about how the work should be presented, and they wanted it rehung and represented. They wanted it a different installation. So I did not agree with that, but we tried to accommodate them as much as we could anyway. And I said to them, okay, I do not want to misrepresent your work. If you say it should be represented this way, then we have to add this kind of didactic textual material they wanted, etc. But I also said to them that if I had known that you wanted that, I wouldn't have gone ahead with the project. But now we're in the middle of install, so it's a different situation. But I would have had a parting of the ways much earlier, you know. So you have to make those, but this is, you have to respect, of course, what people do. You work with other people's material, and that's not just respecting artists, it is also respecting all the people who work with you in all the other functions. So you have to respect that. And there, I think protocols are a very good thing to have, actually. So it's hard to generalize. I think there is a very interesting question, which also someone like, in terms of discussion, when all these boycotts were happening, I was in a discussion with some other curators and theorists in a panel discussion in Berlin. And one of the other people was Oliver Marschad. Some people may know him, philosopher and also art theorist. And he posed a very interesting question: what does it take to stop? Because as we know, art institutions, particularly museums and biennials, they all have this credo, and we have them, it's installed in us as curators: the show must go on. No matter what, the show must go on. But what would it take to stop? Of course, I would say failure is a place where you are stopped often. Yeah. So I think that's interesting. That, of course, it's not up to you to decide when to stop. But it's a very tricky, and that's, you have to negotiate through institutions when you work with them. When do you say enough is enough? Because from the beginning, it's a compromise position. There's nothing pure in it. I don't think there even is an artistic position, but they can claim autonomy, and we can't claim any autonomy. We're functionaries. So you always have to navigate that. What I would say, though, is that is not just about, so I could say, come up with examples of where I felt that I behaved well ethically. Maybe I could come up with the opposite too. Certainly other people would come up with many examples of where they felt I didn't behave ethically or politically in accordance with them. So it needs to be a more intersubjective discussion. And that's one thing that really is missing. Of course, you have it with friends and peers in the profession, but we don't have any kind of fora where we really discuss that. What are our modes of conduct? How do we deal with different situations? Because a lot of people are in the same scenarios. And so, of course, the bigger peer support group you have, the more you can draw on other people's experiences being in that. I think the Sao Paulo one is a particularly interesting one, where you have, of course, a lot of artists saying we will withdraw from this show if this funding is accepted, which it already had been, and you have a biennial that says we do not agree with this political boycott of Israeli state institutions and money. We have therefore taken the money, and proudly so. The curator it's a pretty between a rock and a hard place, that the curators were in at that time, and they of course have to deal with it, which they did in this very strange way. But it was very compromised, and it was a compromise, and I don't think there was much else they could have done.
Thank you for this great lecture. I want to come back to what you called infrastructural critique, of what you were talking about, because you mentioned that this is so much related to digital governance, what I'm interested in. And I was wondering, because you were separating the terms presentation and representation and depresentation, and I think especially in the digital, I think to present something always means to refer to something, to represent something, because it's really embedded in different networks. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah? Okay. So better. So, no, I'm obviously ontologically you're absolutely right. So, but I hadn't thought about it too much, to be honest. So I'll have to think more about that.
Because there we really have a problem. Because at one example, there was a time when WeTransfer, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, asked you when you want to send something, are you a robot? And then you got 4 images. And then one, you have to define where you see the label of the car on it. So you understand for yourself that you have to improve that you are not a robot. It's embedded in representation. But what you are doing in this moment, you're teaching artificial intelligence. So this is maybe a formation of depresentation.
if there are no more urgent questions, which seems to be the case, I would just like to thank you again, and I do think that we might be able to pick up some of those terms that have come up today, tomorrow again. Not only because there is this collaboration between the two of you, but I think several aspects that you have brought up and that you were discussed in the Q&A, I think it would be really nice to kind of bring them in tomorrow. So thank you very much again for this really dense talk.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks.